You're listening to the Complete Human podcast, hosted by co-founders Janna Breslin and Evan DeMarco. We share authentic conversations about wellness, longevity, personal growth, and biooptimization, along with inspiring stories that encourage community and social responsibility. We hope you enjoy this episode.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another edition of the Complete Human podcast with your adorable, goofy host,
Janna Breslin,
and your less than adorable and less goofy host, Evan DeMarco. So for the last couple of weeks, we have brought you a ton of information on mental fortitude as we outlined what we consider the four principles of biooptimization, beginning with mental fortitude, moving into physical health, then spiritual abundance, and then finally planetary connection. So as we broke down mental fortitude, what we wanted to do was lay the groundwork for what would be the next series of conversations, interviews, and ultimately information that we wanted to bring you on the exciting, controversial, very, very wide-scoped concept of physical health.
it's so big.
Thank you.
Cinnamon. Cinnamon. If you guys don't know by now, if you've listened to a few of our episodes, whenever it's awkward and we need to change the topic, the safe word is cinnamon on this podcast.
That might be a record for the fastest time you've pulled out cinnamon. So yeah, here's one of the things that we're going to talk about, right, is there's no one size fits all when it comes to physical health. But the market as it exists now wants you to believe that, right? Do this keto diet, do this paleo diet, do this one exercise, go to just CrossFit. And what we find is that kind of linear, myopic view of health, of physical health, can lead to oftentimes catastrophic results. So we want to build mental fortitude as the foundation piece. We want to transition into physical health and look at all of the different opportunities that exist and recognize that each person is unique, each person is different, and each person's path to physical health is going to be different than your husband, your spouse, your neighbor, your mailman, whatnot. So we want to dive into this, and as we really talk about physical health, the only way to begin that journey is with diagnostic tests, right? So you could walk into a CrossFit class and they can say, well, this is all you need to do. But maybe that's not the case. You could walk into a yoga studio and be like, that's all you need to do. Maybe that's not the case. You could try this diet, or you could try this supplement, or you could try this whatever. And ultimately what we recognize is that if we don't have a baseline of information from which to begin our physical health journey, then oftentimes we're just walking around in the desert.
Mm-hmm.
So
it's very individualistic. I mean, it's not a one size fits all. It's
totally
extremely dependent on each unique person's journey, goals, current health.
Yeah,
it's very different.
Very different. There's 8 billion people on this planet, and each one is unique. We all have unique fingerprints. We all have, so what's to say that one person should do the exact same thing as everybody else?
Mm-hmm. That's what bothers me, I think, about just our industry as a whole. It's like there are so many people that say you have to be vegan, you have to be carnivore, you have to be paleo, you have to do keto. I mean, it's as far as diets goes, and then even just with movement and exercise, there are some strong opinions out there.
That's true. And as we know, opinions are like assholes. Everybody's got one. And most of the time they stink. Most of the time. And that actually leads us into microbiome testing.
I'm loving where this is going.
So we kind of wanted to outline some of the different diagnostic tests that we thought were relevant as you begin a health and wellness journey, right? And again, this is our opinion. It's been really dissected from a lot of the medical experts that we've talked to, our own health and wellness journeys. What we really feel gives us a comprehensive look at where we're at, and then how do we optimize from there. So basically, blood work is one of the most essential things, right? And oftentimes, insurance, our doctors, whatnot, they say, well, let's do your annual blood work at your annual physical. And maybe you fast for a little bit before that, but who knows really what's going on at that one specific point in your life, right? So you get your CBC, you get your metabolic panel, you get, your A1C, you get all these things. But if we look at that in vacuum, in that one day, or that 24, 48, 72 hours leading up to that one day, that might not necessarily be indicative of where we're at. And so our recommendation, quite candidly, is to do blood work as often as possible. The more data, the more that we can start to get ahead of trends. A1C is a big one, right? And that's something that I think that we all need to be wary of. We dropped the Dr. Tina podcast last week, and as we find out in the age of COVID, diabetes is a clear predictor of some major health problems when it comes to COVID. So how do we stay on top of that? How do we get out in front of things like diabetes, looking at A1C? How do we utilize intermittent fasting as a way to kind of work around, or work within our unique, specific human body? So again, that's kind of the overarching concept when it comes to blood work, right? Do it as often as you can so you can start to track patterns, you can start to track trends. And then from there, we kind of get into some of the funner, more technologically advanced tests that you're probably not going to get from your doctor, right? So if you go in and say, hey, doc, I need a microbiome test, he might look at you like you're crazy, in which case you're going to have to go to some alternative places. And we're going to put some of our favorite tests that we've done in the show notes. We're going to talk a lot about those. We're going to be interviewing some of the people from these companies to discuss their unique technologies and how they approach these diagnostic tests. But let's talk microbiome, because we just did this morning.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And what I was also going to ask, I don't think I know of anyone else in the world who's done more testing than you have. So just humor us. How many diagnostic tests do you think you've done in your lifetime?
Oh, God, hundreds.
Mm-hmm.
And for that reason, we talked about it on a previous podcast, but my grandfather was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. I've had pretty good genetic, I think there's a lot of good genetics outside of that. But I did have a doctor say that, there's a potential for this to run in the family. And so what I wanted to do was to understand my unique body. And the best way for me to do that was to just start testing, right? Test, optimized, retest. And so I started doing blood work like almost on a monthly basis. That way I could start to see, I could track the patterns, cholesterol, omega indexes. And being in this space, what I found was that everybody was throwing a test at me, right? Like, try my test. And in vacuum, like I said, what that does is kind of gives us a very myopic view of what's going on. But if we start to combine that with other tests and we start to look at those tests consistently over an extended period of time, we get a much better picture.
Mm-hmm.
Investing, it's called dollar cost averaging, right? If you invest the same amount of money at specific intervals, throughout time, historically you'll end up in the market. Well, why not take the same approach to our health journeys, right? Like, test at specific intervals, and so that way we can start to see, is your testosterone starting to go down? Can you get out in front of that?
Mm-hmm.
Using things like red light therapy. Can you get out in front of that using dietary supplements or diet before you get to the point where you have to start injecting testosterone into your butt?
Mm-hmm.
So, I've taken a lot of tests. I've collected a lot of my own poop, a lot of my own blood. I think my mailman's a little scared, afraid of what he's going to...
Your packages.
Yeah. He's
you're
like,
sending out.
Everything that goes out is human sample.
So I want to highlight something here, because you mentioned something very important, which was you weren't trying to cure or find out what was... You weren't having a health issue and then you started testing yourself. You were proactive and you decided to test prior to any sort of health issue that might have come up. And I think that's really important here is... A lot of people, in my opinion, I think wait until it's too late. They then go to the doctor, or they then go get blood work and diagnostic testing done when there's an issue or there's a problem. They're not feeling well or something happened, and then they have to go get tested. What I've learned over the years is it's so important to stay on top of it regardless. I mean, whether you have health issues or not, get tested. It doesn't matter if you eat the best and you work out and you feel great. That doesn't matter. I think we both agree that you should be proactive regardless of your health status.
Absolutely. And what we're going to find through all of the research, or what we have found through all the research, is that a lot of the indications that could be affect. Let's take atherosclerosis as a perfect example. Plaque buildup. You don't think there's a problem because you feel good. You're eating well. At least you think you're eating well. You're working out based off what you think is a good workout. You're doing all of the things that you think are good, and then all of a sudden you get to 45, 50, and you finally go get the blood work, and you're like, holy shit, my cholesterol's through the roof. So
even Dr. Tina said in our previous podcast was if she started in her 20s or 30s to optimize her health and really look at these markers moving forward, her health would be different now. And she's a doctor. Mm-hmm. It seems like she's in good health now, but she made a great point was, imagine if you started earlier when you are in your 20s and 30s and then optimizing then, how much longer could you live? How much could your health span?
Exponentially.
Right. It's Janna Breslin here. As most of you know, I grew up playing sports which required lots of intensive training. A couple years ago, I switched to CrossFit style workouts, and let's just say my body has taken an absolute beating over the years. I remember waking up after heavy workouts, barely being able to get out of bed. I always added fish oil to my daily regimen for overall wellness and to help combat the post-workout muscle soreness, but my joints and muscles would still be sore for days. I needed something more than just omega-3 fish oil. That's why I take Complete Human PRM Response. This daily super supplement helps my body resolve inflammation quickly so I can live pain-free and keep training. I've been taking it for a while now, and my workouts are better, my recovery is faster, and overall I just feel great. I know we all need a good omega-3 product, and PRM Response is the next generation in omega-3 supplementation with unique pre-resolving mediators that help resolve inflammation quickly so we can get back in the game of life. Head on over to store.completehuman.com to try it 20% off with the code PRM20.
And that brings us to a second point, is that oftentimes when you get blood work, that blood work is going to give you, okay, you're in this acceptable range, you're outside of the acceptable range, either good or bad. And oftentimes what I tell doctors, or what I tell people is, you can't look at that number, right? Because that's going to tell you how you are doing compared to other people your age. Mm-hmm. But the medical system is really skewed, and they allow for this inevitable decline in those markers over time. We talk a lot about inflammaging, right? This progressive inflammatory response that comes with age. Dr. David Sinclair talks about it in his book, which I know you just finished. Mm-hmm. Aging is kind of a disease, right? So if we look at aging as a disease, something that could be prevented with proper care, and then we allow for the medical community to dictate what our numbers should be based off of that inevitable decline that they perceive as just the normal aging process, well, then we're looking at things out of context, because we could say, well, I'm 40 and my numbers look great, but if you compare yourself to a 25-year-old, your numbers might not look that good. Mm-hmm. So we have to start looking at things independent of what the medical community says, this is good, this is bad, and start to recognize that if I want to feel 25 or 30 for the rest of my life, then I have to act accordingly, and these are the numbers that I need to be shooting for.
And I think the disease of aging, just that statement itself, this is something that I recently just heard about, especially with David Sinclair's book. And I know a lot of people are like, what? Aging? That's not a disease. That's inevitable. That happens to everyone. There's no way aging is a disease.
Bullshit!
Aging.
Excuse me.
That was so loud.
My apologies to everybody.
Aging is an option. And that might be kind of unbelievable right now.
It is very unbelievable, because we followed this idea of what our physical lives should be. You're born, you have this adolescence, you have these early 20s, and you kind of get to this point where you peak physically, and then you start this inevitable decline towards, the geriatric existence, and that's simply not the case. We have gotten to the point where we understand the human body well enough to know that aging really is a disease. It's a result of our lifestyle. It's a result of our choices, our environments. And if we were to take out a lot of the, shall we say, catalysts or impetus that lead to that inevitable decline, we would see that our human lifespan and health span could be exponentially longer. Mm-hmm. And that's another thing that we want to talk about too in this, is that physical health should be an extension of the goal for a longer health span. Mm-hmm. We talk a lot about 150, 200, 1,000.
And you hear a lot about lifespan. Oh, how long did you live? But we want to highlight
how well did you live?
Yeah, how well did you live in all of those years? Because that's really what matters.
If you have to spend any amount of time in a diaper, or you can't get an erection.
I was just going to say.
Then
what's the point?
Yeah, if you can't get an erection, then we've got problems. So diagnostic testing begins the platform of what we want to go with this. And then I think as we kind of go through this, we're going to put a lot of information, as I said, and we're going to be interviewing some people that have really kind of perfected some of these diagnostic tests on the microbiome, on the MTHFR, DNA methylation, epigenetics, all of the things that we can really dive into right now to create a path forward for our specific journeys.
I think what's important to start with, we've heard of a lot of people who haven't had any testing done in their whole entire lifetime. They're like, I've never done it. I'm afraid to see what it says. I don't even want to look at what the potentials that could be in there. So, but I want to highlight that it's just do it. It's so important. And a lot of these tests you can just get done with your doctor and get comprehensive, just everything done. I mean, we have examples here like a CBC, basic metabolic panel, comprehensive metabolic panel, blood sugar, lipid panel, hormones, nutrient markers, A1C, and then we talk about STD testing because that's just important anyway. And then we've done some very non-conventional testing ourselves. I feel like we're both little like guinea pig rats.
Oh, we just talked about it. Yes. I mean,
Right.
we literally just pooped in a jar this morning.
It's true. So, I mean,
Is that literally or is that figuratively?
a little bit of both, maybe.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So, check with your doctor on these. Oftentimes insurance is only going to cover one comprehensive blood work, with your annual physical. Sometimes there's an out-of-pocket cost, and oftentimes it's worth it, right? Obviously each person's situation is unique, but if you're really intent on optimizing your health, your physical health, then we can't stress enough the need for some of this diagnostic testing. Now, once we get that, then that opens up the other components of physical health that we really want to get into. And keep in mind that we're not advocating for any one thing, right? Each person's unique, each person's different, and each person has to listen to themselves, understand their own bodies, and figure out what works. So let's get into the next one, which is obviously fitness and strength. This is one of the most controversial ones out there, right? It's, should you lift heavy? Should you lift light? Should you do yoga? Is it Pilates? Is it spin? Is it running? What is it, right?
Yeah, and being in the industry that we've been in, we've heard all of it, literally it all. And I think what it comes down to, for me personally, what I believe is whatever keeps you stress-free and moving, and it's something that you are willing to, you're excited to do it. It makes you happy. I don't care if it's CrossFit or yoga. It doesn't matter. I mean, I think there's a balance between those things. But like we said before, this isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. You really have to find what's best for you, and I think it's whatever you will actually do. If you sign up for CrossFit but you hate it and you never go because you hate it, then there's no value. There's no value there.
I would like to take that one step further and recognize that there are some physical activities that through clinical research have been proven to be more detrimental than they have positive. Long distance running. CrossFit, Olympic style lifting, right? If done improperly, these can be detrimental. And I know I can see your face twitching on this one. And I can hear all of the CrossFitters out there. You're like, go screw yourself. But here's the thing, right? Rhabdomyolysis. This was something that we got rid of when we got rid of like polio.
Rhabdo is still very rare. It's not like a common thing. It's still very rare within the CrossFit.
The data suggests that the percentage increase in rhabdomyolysis is pretty significant, considering the fact that repetitive stress injuries like that all but went away like in the 1920s, right? Like we haven't needed to treat someone for rhabdo in so long. And then along comes CrossFit. And the challenge with CrossFit is, unlike running, which is just there's a whole lot of oxidative stress that takes place with running. The biggest problem with CrossFit and its potential for injury is ego. It cultivates a place where I shouldn't be lifting that weight, but there's a guy sitting next to me who's doing that, and so I'm going to keep up with him. And now I've thrown my back out. I've got rhabdo. I'm pooping blood. It's all sorts of problems. So one of the things that I do want to recognize is that when we look at longevity, maintaining muscle mass is essential. Sarcopenia is one of the clearest indicators of a shorter lifespan. Inability to synthesize amino acids for protein, age-related muscle protein breakdown. So again, we can start to look at some diagnostic testing on this one, but BMI, VO2 max, some of these other ones, like these are great diagnostic tests to recognize where you're at, and then start to really build a plan moving forward. But maintaining muscle mass is essential, and oftentimes what we find is runners, especially guys that are going out, or guys and girls that are going out and pounding 100 miles a week. They end up oxidizing faster. They end up having, severe, joint issues. They end up having a lot of different problems that could be avoided should they introduced some strength training in there.
Right. So lean muscle mass is important. And obviously that's great for bone health too. I mean, when we're talking longevity and health span here, that is one of the key components. So however you like to grow your muscle and increase your bone strength, I mean, that's all we care about.
That sounded deeply pornographic.
Bone strength.
Increase your muscle and bone strength. Janna, pull your mind out of the gutter.
I didn't even think it was that, like...
Oh, so it's my fault now?
It kind of is. Like
Moving on.
You searched on for that one.
So mobility and flexibility. How many of you guys have heard of the sitting rising test? That sounds like it's a tongue twister.
This is something that Evan and I recently came across, was this sitting standing test. And we kind of have fun. We had fun with this one because we're like, oh, we could do that. We could both do that. No problem. And one of us could not do it. And it was not me. I was able to do it. But basically what the idea here is I have it right here. It's 2 basic movements in this sitting rising test, lowering to the floor and standing back up. And this is scored on a 1 to 5 scale with 1 point subtracted each time a hand or knee is used for support and 0.5 points subtracted for loss of balance. This yields a single 10-point scale. So basically, if you can get up off the floor from sitting.
But you have to sit. You have to like hold your hands out in front of you, sit, and then stand back up.
Right. So there's 2 parts to the test. If you can sit on the floor without using knees, arms, elbows, whatever, that's great. And then trying to do it on the way back up, that's another story. Some people can only go down. Some people can only stand up. It kind of just depends. But there's a 10-point scale there, and it's quite interesting. And so... you couldn't do it. I had to throw that in there.
I could not.
No. And so this comes down to mobility and flexibility. And they did some research on this back in 2012 where they had 2,000 adults from ages 51 to 80. And I think it was 6 years later, 159 people died, and the majority of those were those people who had trouble with this test. Mm-hmm. So that's pretty interesting how mobility and flexibility are related to longevity.
Totally.
Yeah.
Well, mobility and flexibility are related to balance and your ability to, I digress. One of the physical tests for ski instructors at like Vail Resorts is something very similar to that. It's not a full pistol squat, but you have to do something kind of similar to that. And what they find is that weeds out older people. And it's not that they want to do that, but those are the physical parameters that they recognize is that if you can't do that, your probability of injury on the mountain is higher. So there's a lot of research and there's a lot of science behind that. And it's interesting that people focus a lot on strength. And these are like your gym rats, guys who can't touch their own shoulder because their biceps are so big. Mm-hmm. But conversely, as they age, that lack of flexibility and that lack of mobility could be very detrimental for their health.
Absolutely. And I even think about children. I mean, if you look at little kids that you see them move, you see them stretching, you see them in these positions on the floor, you're like, how the fuck do you do that? But it makes sense too, because then, I mean, you see that starts changing as you get older. You can't move that way. And I think the key here is to prolong that as long as possible. The younger you are, the more mobile you are. If we can prolong that until...
My daughter likes to traumatize me by dropping down into the splits whenever she can, just because, the look on my face is one of, you're like, ah.
It hurts the eyes.
It hurts a lot of parts. Let's talk about the shoulder flexibility test.
Yeah. So so another part that we're going to get into is that there are 5 places in the body that indicate mobility or lack thereof. And so the shoulders are part of it, as well as the ankles, hips, the thoracic spine, thoracic, which is the middle of the back, just way easier to say. And then
just not as cool.
And then your neck. So and I like to give action items to you guys too. So if you know that those are parts of your body that you have issues moving, there are so many YouTube videos or programs that you can just look up online, stretching and everything. But those are the 5 places in the body that indicate a lack of mobility. And if we can focus on those areas, I think our bodies would hurt less.
Okay, so bring us back to the shoulder, the shoulder flexibility test.
Okay, so I guess this is called the zipper test, and it evaluates the flexibility and mobility of your shoulder joint. So use one hand to reach behind your neck between your shoulders. Can you do this?
No.
Probably not. While reaching behind your back toward your shoulders with the other, and measure how far apart your hands are. So I can touch my hands.
About 6 months ago, maybe not even that long ago, someone showed me what would be considered a CrossFit stretch with a pipe.
Yeah.
And in doing that, so basically it was you flip the pipe.
It's like the pipe, if you're watching this on YouTube, you'll be able to see a better visual, but if you take the pipe behind you with one arm and then pull it underneath, you stretch under here, and you're able to kind of really open up the shoulders and get that mobility going. And I showed Evan how to do this, and all of a sudden we heard this pretty loud pop, and you dislocated your shoulder with that.
Yes.
With that exercise.
Fucking CrossFit.
All of us can do it fine.
Yeah. Moving on.
Anyway, so the flexibility and mobility, it's important. There are 5 areas to focus on. You guys can look at, YouTubes, and there's plenty of stuff out there. Just Google how to assess your mobility and your full body flexibility.
Cool.
Yep.
So that brings us to diet. Google diet. Just put diet into Google, and you're going to find
too much stuff.
Too much. And I want to kind of go back in time. So if we look at the evolution of man, we've always understood that keeping weight off was essential to our survival. Right? So saber-toothed tiger descends on the tribe. And if you're carrying an extra 5 or 10 pounds, that means you're not running away as fast. Your fight or flight might, throw enough adrenaline into your system. But if you're carrying that extra weight, guess what? Your saber-toothed tiger's dinner. Mm-hmm. As we kind of evolved through the years, we instinctually recognized that keeping weight off was essential to our health. And, let's look at, just the Greeks and how they advocated health and wellness, how they advocated an active lifestyle. We look at everything almost up until modern day America, which does the complete opposite. Sit in front of the TV as long as you can, eat McDonald's as much as you can, play this video game as much as you can. So what has happened over the years is we've become metabolically inflexible. Mm-hmm. And metabolic flexibility is really defined by a bunch of different things, and there's not really a test for metabolic flexibility, but you can start to recognize certain things. And we're going to talk a lot about metabolic flexibility with one of the diagnostic tests guests that we've got coming up in a few weeks. But diet is kind of an extension of those diagnostic tests. If you recognize that, hey, or maybe you've been one of those people that thinks that kale is the greatest thing since sliced bread, but all of a sudden you find out through your diagnostic test that, you can't process that kale as well, and that an oxalate in that could be carcinogenic for you. So we always have to come back to, what does the test say about our microbiome, about the way that we process food, and then we move on accordingly. So as we dive into diet, my ultimate response is keto, paleo, vegan, pescatarian, Mediterranean, they're all bullshit. And they're all bullshit because they seek to sell you something. What we're telling you is that do the diagnostic test and then figure out your own diet. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's a combination of paleo and pescatarian. Maybe it's, who knows. Maybe you're the person that needs to be on the only cheese diet. It doesn't matter, but stop listening to the people out there trying to sell you something and look at the test and say, that's what's right for me.
Right. Like what works for me. And that even can start with just food intolerance or food allergy testing. Mm-hmm. I know for me, I've done keto, I've done paleo. I tried vegan for a day and I was like, nope.
Yeah.
I've tried a variety of diets, and I think what I noticed felt best for me was after doing diagnostic testing, seeing what came back, realizing that gluten and dairy were a no-go for me, and beef. I guess I'm allergic to beef, but once I took
because you have Lyme disease.
He's convinced I have Lyme. We need another diagnostic test. So once I took out the things that I knew were not working for me specifically, my health improved, my sleep improved, my work, just the inflammatory response to my body was better. So it's so important for as far as diet and food, like find out what works for you. And maybe that's diagnostic testing. Maybe that's trying out a certain diet, seeing how you feel.
I want to push back a little bit on that, because oftentimes we have, let's say you've been on the Cheetos diet for a really long time.
Okay. But is that realistic?
It is. And,
All right.
and we can look at that when we look at the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio that's so prevalent in the United States. We've talked a little bit about this in the past, but about 200 years ago, the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio was about 4-1. And what we determined was that was pretty optimal for our health.
Mm-hmm.
With all of the processed food and all the crap that we're putting in our body, the average American exists at about a 20-1. That omega-6 at that quantity is so inflammatory.
Mm-hmm.
So again, the disease of inflammation, the disease of aging really is a construct of the diets that we have for a lot of people. But if you're on the all Cheeto McDonald's diet, and then all of a sudden you switch to kale smoothies, well, you might feel pretty good. That simple shift to fresh fruits and vegetables might make you feel that much better, but coincidentally enough, you still might not be one of those people that processes kale very well. So again, we can listen to our bodies, but we can listen to them only up to a point where, if we're doing something so catastrophic and then we make some incremental change toward the better, that's going to make us feel better, but it could still be detrimental. So we always come back to the diagnostic test.
Yeah.
What does the testing say?
And I think there's room for both, test and also maybe try out and see what works best for you. But the tests typically don't lie either. So it's good to be mindful of the information that you get from that.
True.
Yeah. So metabolically flexible, to be metabolically flexible, I'm sure this is the first time many people have heard of this term.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a certain, I guess I'm asking you, is there a certain diet or way of eating that makes someone more metabolically flexible?
Metabolic flexibility would be defined as your body's ability to utilize available fuel sources for fuel. So the problem with keto, multiple problems with keto, is it's not sustainable by and large. It causes erectile dysfunction.
That sounds like personal experience.
No, sometimes I have to joke. So there is the reality that we can burn carbs for fuel.
Mm-hmm.
And so metabolic flexibility really is that your body needs to be able to actively and efficiently shift between burning separate fuel sources. Burning carbohydrates when you're active or you're working out, burning fat when you're at rest.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the diets have changed that metabolic flexibility, where all of a sudden if you're keto and then you have some carbohydrate, then your body's completely out of whack. And it doesn't know how to actively and efficiently shift between those two fuel burning mechanisms. So that would be the ultimate goal of metabolic flexibility. Now, metabolic flexibility happens through a wide range of things, and that's through intermittent fasting, that's through cold exposure, increasing the amount of brown fat that you have in your body. It's obviously mitochondrial function, so making sure that we have healthy and numerous mitochondria in our system, and that comes from working out, that comes from things like PEMF, where we talk about mitochondrial biogenesis and mitochondrial bioenergetics. So when we start to really peel back the layers of metabolic flexibility, we recognize that we should be able to eat not what we want, but we should be able to eat, macros in specific groups based off of our energy requirements.
Like, for example, let's say you go to a birthday party and there's a huge piece of cake there and you're like, you know what, I'm going to have this. I never usually have cake, but I'm going to have that whole entire cake to myself right now. The idea with metabolic flexibility is you could have that and not have a horrible outcome because of it.
I was at a medical conference one time, and I've told this story a few times, but we sit down to dinner, and I'm with some of the biggest names in kind of the doctor health space. And the waiter comes over. There's probably like 15 of us at the table, and the waiter comes over and starts taking orders. And everybody's like, well, I'm vegan, I can't have this. I'm pescatarian, I can't have this. I only eat this, I only eat this. Mm-hmm. And people are making menu modifications straight across the board. I mean, the waiter looked like he wanted to shoot himself in the face. So then the guy gets to me, and I'm like, I just order, just to be an ass. I'm like, I'll have the T-bone, I'll have a bottle of wine, I'd like a loaf of bread, could I have some French fries? And people are just looking at me, they're like, oh my God, what's wrong with you? And one of them said, you're a thought leader in this space, how can you eat like that? And my response is, I can eat like that because I'm metabolically flexible. I haven't put myself in such a rigid box that I can't step outside of it. Now, granted, certain people have, celiacs or gluten intolerances.
Mm-hmm.
They shouldn't be eating a loaf of bread like I did.
Mm-hmm.
And I shouldn't have really ate a loaf of bread, but goddamn was it good. So metabolic flexibility to that extent is my ability, based off of the way that I've conditioned my body, to actively switch between those burning processes, those fuel sources.
Mm-hmm.
And when we focus on diagnostic testing, so I know what foods I can eat or what work really well for me, and then if I eat those, then I'm fine.
So we've all heard, like, oh, they can eat whatever they want because they're young. Would you say that the youth are more metabolically flexible? And is it because they haven't conditioned themselves to eat a certain way at a certain point? Like, I'm curious about age difference and what that means as far as metabolically flexible.
I'm gonna answer a question with a question.
Okay.
Do you remember when you were in college? And if
Mm-hmm.
I'm telling tales outside of school, I apologize. But you'd go out and you'd drink all night long,
Mm-hmm.
and then you'd somehow make it to your 9 o'clock class and be somewhat functional, and then you'd do it all again the very next night.
And now at 30, you have like a tequila soda, and then you don't get up until 11 o'clock the next day.
Exactly. So my question is, are we better at, is age a better indication of our metabolic flexibility? To a certain extent, yes. But I think age is also we just don't care enough. Our body's probably still screaming at us that you shouldn't be eating this, you shouldn't be drinking this, you shouldn't be doing this. But, in our 20s and our teens and our 20s, we just don't pay attention to our body.
Mm-hmm.
Billy Crystal did that great thing in City Slickers where he kind of goes through the whole aging process of human beings. It's like in your teens and your 20s, you think you're immortal.
Mm-hmm. You are.
Yeah. Until you're not. And then all of a sudden,
Right.
30 hits, you're like, yikes.
Yeah.
So small investments in metabolic flexibility, especially when we teach our kids these things, using diagnostic testing on our kids and
Mm-hmm.
find out what they can eat, what they can't eat, and act accordingly.
Right.
If you made those investments in your child at 5, 6, 10, what is their life going to be like? People always think there's no way that a human being can live to 150. You take a kid at 10 years old and you start optimizing their entire diet, their
Mm-hmm.
lifestyle, how they eat, how they work out, where they live, the type of pollutants that they're exposed to, the toxins. You don't think they can live to 150? A kid's going to live to be 1,000.
Mm-hmm. Some of our listeners might disagree.
We welcome that debate, and
Mm-hmm.
science is ultimately going to be the telltale on that one. But we're at the cusp of understanding what we can really do as a species.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, the future is, it's right around the corner here. Lots of really cool things coming up, I think.
Totally. Now, for us to actually get to that place, we have to optimize sleep.
Mm-hmm.
So, in the Industrial Revolution, how many hours of sleep should you get a night? What's the average answer?
What, 8? Like everyone says 8 hours, right?
8. And interestingly enough, 8 hours of sleep came out of the Industrial Revolution. And so society decided that they had to break down our time into manageable chunks. 8 hours of sleep, 8 hours of work, 8 hours of family time.
Mm-hmm.
But interestingly enough, how long is a sleep cycle?
What's like 1.5 hours or something?
90 minutes, right?
Yeah.
So how do you get 8 hours of sleep with a 90-minute sleep cycle? You can't. And so what you end up with is like 6, 7.5, or 9 hours are the appropriate amount of times. One of the biggest issues is kind of that jolt that comes from an alarm clock.
Mm-hmm.
So if we're in the middle of a sleep cycle, especially some of those deeper ones, and we snap out of sleep
Mm-hmm.
because of an alarm clock, that has pretty catastrophic, effect on our physiological being.
Yeah.
Now, what happens? Most people are like, oh, and so they hit the snooze button, right?
Mm-hmm.
So then your cortisol switch turns all the way up to get you out of bed because now it's like fight or flight. You're so exhausted because your melatonin switch is still turned all the way up. So now you've got these competing hormones in your body. You think, well, I'll just lay here for 8 minutes.
Right.
That 8 minutes, 9 minutes is just enough time for that cortisol switch to dial all the way back, melatonin to stay high. And so then what happens, right? The alarm goes off again, and it's
it's
same.
like the switching back and forth, and
Yeah.
that's what probably causes, you're more tired throughout the day.
Mm-hmm. And so one of the things that we can do to optimize sleep is, try to set your sleep cycle so that you're focused on 6, 7.5, 9 hours. If you need 9 hours of sleep,
Mm-hmm.
don't be ashamed of that. There's nothing
Yeah.
wrong with that. And then go to bed at an appropriate time so that you're not waking up to that jarring alarm clock.
Mm-hmm.
Sleep optimization is going to be one of the greatest predictors of long-term health.
Mm-hmm.
Now, let's talk about some of the problems. We've chatted a little bit about this in the past, but on average, What's the first thing most people do when they get out of bed?
Phone.
Exactly, right? Before they go to the bathroom, before they defecate, before there's excrement, before they brush their teeth, they're
such a good word, excrement.
They're laying in bed.
Right. Look at their phone.
Looking at their phone. And whether that's social media, whether that's email, it doesn't matter.
Blue light.
Blue light, but a biochemical reaction that's no different than pulling a slot machine lever.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. I mean, social media, you just keep scrolling. What's next? What's next? What's next?
Mm-hmm.
And
so
the blue light and then that hormonal response as well.
Yeah. Now, blue light is a good thing, right? Because blue light is the thing that activates cortisol in our body. It turns off the melatonin switch. But our greatest source of blue light is the sun. You want to get out of bed appropriately, sleep your 6, 7.5, 9 hours, wake up and go sit naked in the sun for 10 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that is the perfect way to get out of bed. Drink some water first. That would be ideal because you're going to be dehydrated after that amount of time. But that would be ideal. Don't even look at your phone. Because the biochemical interaction, the blue light activation, especially at that short wavelength, is going to cause some pretty big problems, right? So you go throughout your day, and you've got blue light activation, you've got all those stress hormones, those stress chemicals, and then we get down towards the end of our day, and what's the last thing most people do before they go to bed? They check their phone, right? So now we've interrupted our sleep patterns with that blue light activation. Sleep begins as that melatonin switch starts to turn on and cortisol starts to turn off. So if we're activating blue light, or that if we're seeing that blue light and it's keeping that cortisol switch on, how was our sleep patterns interrupted?
Right.
And that doesn't even discuss the fact that there's a number of people, Generation X, millennials, who admit to waking up in the middle of the night to check social media.
Yeah, it's disgusting.
It's horrible. So we can't even begin to talk about the benefits of sleep, but here's what it is. Tips and tricks: charge the phone in another room, plan 6, 7.5, 9 hours back into that time frame accordingly so you're not utilizing some crazy alarm to wake up. And then
try and eliminate your phone use, like what, an hour before bed?
About an hour before bed and an hour after you wake up.
At least.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I've read somewhere if you can go, like the longest you can go after you wake up too, and even probably before bed, that's probably even better, even more ideal. But I mean, test this. Try it out for a few nights. See if you sleep better. See if you're more rested.
Totally.
Yeah.
So sleep is essential. It's one of the fundamental components of health. And if we start to have interrupted sleep patterns, which is what we're seeing, the long-term ramifications are horrible. Cognitive decline, beta amyloid plaques and tangles. Oh, let's chat real fast because I forgot about this. The glymphatic system. Ever heard of this?
Only through you.
Okay, so there's the lymphatic system, which is how your body drains toxins, all that. But you have this glymphatic system. So what happens as you sleep is cerebral spinal fluid comes up into the brain and goes spin cycle on all the beta amyloid plaques and tangles, the things that lead to cognitive decline, Alzheimer's, and dementia. Now, that only happens in the deepest levels of sleep. So if we're constantly interrupting our sleep patterns, that cerebral spinal fluid wash, that glymphatic drainage, which is responsible for really keeping our brains healthy and keeping our brains free of the beta amyloid plaques and tangles that lead to Alzheimer's and dementia, start to become more and more prevalent.
Right.
Now, this is true in gamers, and we're seeing this a lot in gamers, people that are in their 20s, 30s, and 40s that are starting to exhibit signs of cognitive decline. Excessive blue light exposure, poor diet, sedentary lifestyle, and interrupted sleep patterns. If you're a gamer, go out and run a couple miles right now. Don't do a CrossFit class. So anyway, that's just...
Well, and this also highlights the importance of, maybe you can fall asleep fine, but if you wake up a lot in the middle of the night, this is, just what you were talking about with the glymphatic system. And it kind of comes back to testing as well, because from my experience, from what I've known and have experienced, as well as some of my family members, if you wake up a lot in the middle of the night, or you wake up around like that 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the morning, like wide awake, that's usually, that can indicate an adrenal fatigue, because your cortisol, right? And so this also comes back to that testing, because you can test and see, how are my adrenals functioning? Is it causing sleep disturbances? Because we need that spinal brain wash. That's so cool. Spinal fluid wash.
Cerebral spinal fluid wash.
Cool stuff.
Very cool.
Yeah, get that sleep.
So that brings us to the fun conversation of dietary supplements.
Right. And this is controversial, because I've talked about supplements for a long time, and I've gotten a lot of pushback from people saying, if I eat well and if I'm nourishing my body the correct way, I don't need to take supplements.
Bullshit.
And I know this is something that you and I fully agree. And
But you didn't always agree. You were, when I think I first met you, you weren't outright saying you can get everything from diet, but I think you were a little bit more on the natural side, that a lot of the nutrients that we can get can come from our diet.
I mean, you should shoot for that, right? You should still eat your vegetables and fruits and
Totally.
like get those micronutrients. I've been taking supplements for 15 years. So I've never once relied on solely on food for dietary or for nutrients. On a personal level, I believe that our soil and where our food is coming from, it's so depleted now compared to years ago. I don't think that our food has the amount of nutrients that it had years ago. So I think we both agree that it is imperative to supplement these days.
Part of the 5 pillars, the 5 principles that we've discussed are, how do you diagnostic test? How do you eat? How do you sleep? And how do you supplement? And supplementation, by its very definition, was designed to supplement a diet that you couldn't achieve all of these essential vitamins and minerals.
Mm-hmm.
Now, 200 years ago, if you're a potato farmer in Kansas City and you didn't have oranges or apples, you might need a vitamin C supplement,
Mm-hmm.
right? You might need something to prevent scurvy.
Right.
The problem is that our world has changed so drastically in the last couple hundred years. I read a report yesterday that said an average of 50% of all homes in the United States have toxic mold.
Oh yeah, we are bombarded with toxins these days.
So what's the best dietary source of glutathione, which is one of the master detoxifiers for your body?
Mm-hmm. As far as supplements goes?
No. So when I have these conversations with people who are just pro-food, no anti-supplement, like,
Right.
where do you get the amount of glutathione necessary to detoxify your body from, the volatile chemicals in the paint in your house, the mold,
Right.
the amount of smog in the air, all of these things, let's fundamentally recognize that this argument that this is how we ate 200 years ago presupposes that the world is the same as it was 200 years ago, and that's simply not the case.
Right. And this even goes back. So as far as diagnostic testing too, there's a lot of things you can find out about your specific system that might indicate that you need more help with supplementation. For example, myself, if it weren't through testing, I would not have known that I had MTHFR mutations.
Mm-hmm.
I have 2, which means
You're a mutant.
basically like an alien or something. It makes a lot of sense, doesn't it?
Totally.
So when you have these genetic mutations that I do, and they're quite common, I think like 50% of the population has them, you can't get rid of toxins as easy as someone who doesn't have these mutations. So I have to supplement to make sure I'm detoxing properly, that I'm pulling toxins away from my system that we're getting from our everyday life.
Mm-hmm.
We can't escape it. It is around, it's in the air, it's in our homes, regardless how clean things are, there's still toxins everywhere.
Yeah. And let's talk about polyunsaturated fatty acids.
Let's do it.
One of my favorites. So if you go eat sushi 5 times a week, what's going to happen?
Mercury.
Exactly.
Which I know.
Your brain's going to be Swiss cheese after a while. They call it sushi brain for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
So, but let's say that I'm really excited about the polyunsaturated fatty acids, the EPA, the DHA, that come from that. So one of the best ways to do that is supplementation, right?
Mm-hmm.
The WHO, the CDC, all of these global health organizations recommend, that we need at least 400 milligrams of polyunsaturated fatty acids, omega-3s every single day. That's very difficult to get from your diet. And I am going to take an adamant, public stand against all of you vegans out there that you cannot get that from chia and flax. Chia and flax converts to EPA and DHA at about max 10%. So you're going to have to eat a bucket of chia seeds, and the way that stuff swells, you're just going to explode, right? And let's acknowledge the fact that, that ALA, that the ALA in those products can go rancid really fast. So, we have to acknowledge that there are places for some of these supplements, and there are certain supplements based off of the world that we live in that aren't supplements anymore. They're essentials.
Mm-hmm.
So
Absolutely.
the health and wellness journey, the physical health that we talk about, begins and ends with diagnostic testing.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we want to take that one step further, right? Because it's test, optimize, and then retest.
Mm-hmm.
So often, you go to your doctor, you get your cholesterol, Doctor says you have high cholesterol. Let's put you on a statin. Maybe you take it, maybe you don't. But you're like, I'm going to go eat oatmeal every morning because, Quaker
It's
says
heart
that.
healthy.
Yes. And then you wait another year and you wonder why your cholesterol hasn't moved. Or maybe it's gone up a little bit, or maybe it's only gone down a little bit. But if we're testing consistently and we're using the multitude of tests available to us that give us food recommendations, exercise recommendations, then that is the impetus of biooptimization. That's the root of it, is for 6 months I can follow this protocol to the letter. And then when I retest, I'm like, holy cow, that worked. Or maybe it didn't, and maybe I need to tweak something. But small corrections are the things that lead to big changes. And whether or not you want to live to be 150 or 1,000 or a millennium, it doesn't matter. It's the quality of life that you have. And when we come back to this idea that disease or that aging is a disease, we now, for the first time in human history, have the tools to fight back against that disease.
It's so true.